Meneer de voorzitter, meneer de vastsecretaris, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's for me a very great pleasure to be here this afternoon in the last session of the Lentecyclus of the Academy. And my topic is the EU and its neighbours. It is a topic which is very vast, utterly complex, highly political in nature, very sensitive, increasingly mediatized. And it's indeed very much at the crossroads of legal, political, and economic debate, I think. That means, for me, it's mission impossible in half an hour to go into the details of EU neighbourhood policy. And in my presentation, I will start by saying that I'm concentrating myself on the European neighbourhood. The EU's direct European neighbourhood goes from the Principality of Andorra to the Russian Federation. And in other words, there are many European states which are not part of the European Union. And there is a very great diversity among them. The issue of EU enlargement, of course, is an important and very special aspect of the EU's neighbourhood relations. It was examined last week by Professor Wouters, and today I can thus be very brief. But each EU enlargement implies a shifting of borders and affects necessarily the EU's neighbourhood. Perhaps in the light of this topic here this afternoon, let me just recall, and that's the only thing I will do about EU enlargement, is to recall the official discourse of the European Union on EU enlargement. Why have we been enlarging all the time? EU enlargement has always been presented as something which was good for everybody. In this view, and I think it almost became a dogma, EU enlargement was not only a good thing for those involved in the enlargement process itself, but it contributed to the stability and prosperity, I quote, of the entire European continent. No doubt, this reasoning sounds very nice and may even be true. But, there is a but, it must also be said, that's at least my opinion, that it is only workable as long as those who are not involved in that process are prepared to share that view. At the end of the 90s, Russia, the biggest, and I am sure forever, whether we like it or not, forever, the most important neighbor, started to challenge this approach. And this cannot but seriously affect the relations between the European Union and the Eastern European neighborhood as a whole. I come back to this point in the very last part of my presentation. For the moment, we are not yet there. The first thing I would like to examine with you is the relations between the European Union and the EFTA countries. I must say it's probably the most technical part, and you don't have all to leave the room here when it becomes too technical, because the other parts of my presentation are less technical, I think. But you know that European Free Trade Association was created in 1960 as a reaction to the European Economic Community. It still exists today, but in a strongly reduced format, since many of its members joined the European Union. The EFTA today is only Norway, Switzerland, it's a very strange composition, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. That's the EFTA. The establishment of the European Economic Area, the EEA, in 1992 was perhaps the most fascinating project in the field of EU neighbourhood relations. Between 1985, and the President of the Court mentioned that in his presentation, between 1985 and 1992, under the leadership of Jacques Delors, the European community was very much engaged in an ambitious undertaking to establish a strong internal market with free movement of goods, persons, service and capital, and precisely very much also with an area without borders among the member states. However, the neighbors of the European community at the time, that were basically in the first place the EFTA countries, were very concerned about this initiative. And they perceived it as a beginning of a fortress Europe. And gradually but surely, the idea arose that to create a large internal market not only composed by the EU member states, but to also include the EFTA states. Of course, it was not obvious, and certainly not an easy thing, to extend the EU's internal market to the EFTA neighbors. This necessarily implied the creation of a very solid, sui generis, and sophisticated institutional structure. I'm not going to explain how these institutional mechanisms have been working, but I think they did a very good job. Certainly, nothing is perfect in this world. And there is, for example, concern about backlog and delays, etc. But notwithstanding this, I think it is fair to say that the EEA, the European Economic Area, has achieved what most people thought was simply impossible to achieve. And that is the creation of an internal market with neighbors who are not part of the European Union. Seen in this perspective, the EEA remains a very attractive and I think unique model for an orderly and well-structured integration of the EU's internal market beyond its borders. But, and this may be unfortunate, it is very difficult to imitate it. And it's even more difficult, I think, to transpose it to other neighborhood relations. We have tried in the early 2002, 2003, attempts were made to try to see whether we could use it in the Eastern European relationship. And in the beginning there was enthusiasm about this, but very quickly it appeared to be too ambitious and not realistic, really, unrealistic. Let me just add that now attempts are being made. Maybe very few people know this, but I'm sure a few in this room know it very well. Attempts are being made to draw inspiration from the European Economic Area experience for setting up an integrated structure between the EU and Andorra, Monaco and San Marino. From the point of view of substance, the EEA is definitely the main point of reference in the current negotiations for an association agreement between the European Union and these states. I turn now to Switzerland. I must be very careful with that. I lived myself almost 5 years in Switzerland. I can be biased. I will try to be as neutral as I can, which is very classical in a Swiss context. But you never know, you never know. You start with it and you don't know where you stop with it, so must be careful. If I see, in particular, the chair making strange signs, then I know that I should switch to another topic. But Switzerland, first point, is an extremely important trading partner. I don't know whether you realize that. After United States and China, number 3 in world trade of the European Union is Switzerland. So this is already a first starting point. Switzerland was also one of the big advocates of the European Economic Area. It was really one of the promoters of it. But to the great astonishment of everybody, including the Swiss government, of course, the Swiss population rejected by 50.3 majority in a referendum in '92 the Swiss participation to the EEA. Afterwards, there was really no other alternative anymore than just to continue to organize the relations between the EU and Switzerland on a bilateral basis. At the end of the day, this explains why now with Switzerland, it is a bit ridiculous, but I have to mention it, we have more than 120 bilateral agreements. I am very often in touch with Swiss colleagues and diplomats and so on, and they even don't know how many agreements they have been concluded. So it's maybe 150. The first agreement was on cheese and watches, and the last one is a bit more sensitive. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a bank account in Switzerland, be very careful, because the European Union has concluded with Switzerland an agreement on automatic exchange of information and of bank data of nationals having fiscal residence in one of the member states. So be careful with this. Okay. When I say 120 agreements, this is by far the record, of course, in the bilateral agreements ever concluded by the European Union. I don't know of any other. I've been working a lot on bilateral agreements, wrote quite big monographs on it. Nothing can be compared with the Swiss situation. But after the rejection of the EEA, we continued the bilateral road, but we tried also to regroup bilateral. That makes negotiations easier, of course. When you simultaneously negotiate on various bilateral agreements, you can make concession in one and get something in the other. Negotiations, so we used the term clusters and so on, but we also continued with individual bilateral agreements. Now, we have one big problem with this bilateralism, if I can use that expression. That is that these agreements now and then penetrate very deeply into aspects of the internal market. Now, the problem with all these agreements with Switzerland is that they don't offer any guarantee for the development of the law in the EU regarding the internal market. So if the EU on the internal market develops every day virtually, so how can an agreement which is static in a way, how can it integrate the development of the law at the side of the European Union? So this is a big problem. The EU gets more and more nervous about it, wants to conclude what it is calling a comprehensive institutional framework agreement. It's a long-term comprehensive institutional framework agreement. It's already on the table for it since a couple of years. The progress for the moment is virtually zero, because the Swiss are not very, very happy, and also here the Court of Justice is the breaking point in a way, I think. So this is the situation. The EU has clearly said in recent statements, because the Swiss want just to continue with the bilateral relations and the bilateral agreements, and just to continue this. But the EU has said that the bilateralism, I quote, they are not my words, has reached its limits. It's very strong wording in diplomatic jargon, I would say. That's reached the limit. And we will see how it will evolve. It's very difficult to predict, I must say, because I know also a bit the Swiss, I know Switzerland a bit, and my sympathy very often goes to that country as well. But it's difficult to see how this will evolve. I now could fill the rest of my time, speaking time, with just examples of little incidents, of big incidents, but also, of course, of the results of this bilateralism. It's not all negative, of course. It's to a very large extent very positive also. But I'm sure you have, because all this got into the media, the Swiss referendum of 2000, you see referendum. I lived in Switzerland. I remember situations where 10% of the people were voting in the referendum. And then 5% of the 5 and something of the 10% decide on an important matter. I have seen that when I was living there. But one referendum I just want to mention, then I stop this, with regard to Switzerland. The famous referendum on migration of the 9th of February 2014, which was won by those who were very strongly the extreme right party in Switzerland, which is 26-27% in the parliament. They won the referendum, and the result was that there was an open conflict with one of the agreements, one of these 120 agreements, is on free movement of persons between the European Union and Switzerland. And according to the terms of the referendum, conflicting agreements had to be renegotiated by Switzerland within 3 years' time, because the referendum changed immediately the constitution. After the referendum, the constitution in Switzerland was changed. So this was the situation, but of course then to renegotiate for Switzerland an agreement on free movement of persons with whom? With the European Union. The European Union must be prepared to do it, and the EU was not prepared to do it. So we got into very big trouble, but as no one then happens with Switzerland, and not just with Switzerland, the Swiss found a pragmatic solution in December just a few months ago, last year. I'm not going into the details of that pragmatic solution. If there are questions, I can try to answer them. But let's move now to a much more sensitive, much more difficult topic. Must be careful with my time also. I started a bit later, Chair, you saw it. I'm only using now about 15 minutes. Okay. But my time normally now is over. Turkey. Turkey is a fascinating topic to study in the framework of EU relations. I always get excited about it. The most important point, or starting point, of course, is the Association Agreement of 1963, which is a very, very interesting association agreement because it's one of the very rare association agreements which clearly are genuine pre-accession agreements. There are not many of this type of pre-accession agreements, but this one is one. Okay, you see some people say pre-accession agreements. Let me just quote the preamble. The preamble says that states that I just quote now. It's not my words. The support given by the EEC to the efforts of the Turkish people to improve their standard of living will facilitate, I know it comes, the accession of Turkey to the European community at a later date. Stop quoting. Article 28, even twice reference like this, explicitly refers to the possibility of accession of Turkey to the community. What I find interesting, extremely interesting, I like very much history, and in particular history of Ottoman Empire, and the history of Turkey is one of my hobbies. And in my book collecting as well, which is a dangerous exercise. But it is interesting to note that in 1963, when the agreement with Turkey was signed, the fact that 95% of the country, including its capital, together with the fact that Turkey, of course, was predominantly a country of Muslim religion, that all this was not an issue in the negotiations. It was not even mentioned once. So the religious dimension in this negotiation was zero. Another series of lectures in the framework of the Lentecyclus, but I don't think this is in the planning of the academy here. But the political side, I just want to take 1 or 2 points really, because I had more than that, but I still want to say a word about Russia and the Eastern Partnership, and that I must really then have the watch in my hands. So, but on the political side, 1 or 2 elements which are important. EU-Turkey. Turkey applied for membership to the Union. Of course, it had such a pre-accession agreement. It's not astonishing that it applies. It's natural, logical, I would say. The Commission gives a negative opinion, in my opinion, totally justified in 1989. But then comes the big change in Central and Eastern Europe. What is Turkey seeing? It sees that these countries which were behind the Iron Curtain get a kind of privileged treatment in the pre-accession atmosphere, pre-accession strategy of the European Union. And Turkey is left aside. So we see a lot of frustration growing. More than that even. And we will start a period of rather gloomy relationship, EU-Turkey. But the gloomy relationship will in 1999 in Helsinki, at the European Council of Helsinki, set aside. The Helsinki conclusions of the European Council say about Turkey the following, and I think not everybody knows that. Turkey, I quote, are not my words, it is a candidate state destined, and in English destined means you cannot really escape it, destined. If it is the destination of Turkey, Turkey is destined to join the, I repeat, the candidate state destined to join the Union on the basis of the same criteria as the other candidate states. I draw attention to the fact that conclusions of the European Council are taken by unanimity. That meant that all the member states in 1999 agreed with that, otherwise you would not have this conclusion. In October 2005 we have accession negotiations. It is a very difficult start because we are just after the fiasco of the constitution, European constitution, which failed. So that was not the best moment really to start negotiations with Turkey. And another point when you study Turkey relations, EU-Turkey relations, that is that Cyprus is never far away. The Cyprus problem always erupts now and then and becomes a kind of predominant factor in the negotiations. So that meant that even the Cyprus situation affected the negotiation in a way that we because of the Turkish policy towards Cyprus, the negotiations evolved in a direction that we stopped opening chapters, new chapters on negotiating with Turkey. So that means that since 2006, these negotiations virtually have not moved except on a number of chapters which are really not the most important ones. But then a last comment on Turkey, on the recent developments. I think I'm obliged to do that. For a variety of reasons, which have not only to do with domestic political situations in the EU, but very much with the internal ones in Turkey itself. Today's picture of these relations, EU-Turkey, is very, very gloomy indeed, very not positive at all. And there is a rapidly growing perception and conviction in the EU that in the last decade, Turkey has been alienating itself from the basic values of the Union than moving towards them. I think I share this view myself personally. But on the other hand, we must also admit that whatever our views are, Turkey is there. And Turkey remains to be strategically a very important neighbor of the European Union. And we have seen that, of course, in the famous statement of 18th of March 2016 on the migration crisis, which not only included provisions on the crisis, but also on re-energizing, is the word used, of the accession process, acceleration of visa liberalization. Needless to say also that the failed coup which came afterwards, that was July last year, and the events following that coup, that all this has not been very conducive to develop a smoothly relationship EU-Turkey. Turkey is now a state with thousands of people in prison, thousands have lost their jobs, and not all of them were, in one way or another, implicated in the failed coup d'etat. I have some friends even who share that fate now in Turkey. More than 150 journalists are in prison. Does it mean that we should stop accession negotiating with Turkey? We had this on the table just a week ago, or a good week ago, in Malta, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they took, I think, the right decision not to stop, because stopping is really breaking, I think, any influence you can still have. But I think if Erdogan still goes a bit further, let's say introducing capital punishment, then we might well have this breaking of the negotiations. Turkey and Eastern Partnership. Now, I have 5 minutes. Yes, thank you, Chair. Very complex topic, of course. I would like to say, and that the thing I wanted to definitely to mention, in my opinion, the West owes a lot to the Soviet leadership under Gorbachev. Many of the changes which took place in Central and Eastern Europe would probably not have occurred had the coup d'etat against Gorbachev been successful. We would not have been talking about enlargement, I think. We would not have had the picture of Europe that we have today. I find it very unfortunate that this is almost forgotten today. That's the reason why I want to start with that. The EU-Russia relations are in a very difficult state for the moment. It is my personal view that for this state of affairs, there is a shared responsibility. It's not just black and white. The picture is more nuanced, in my opinion. So that means that the EU also has some responsibility in this situation, in my opinion. Now, one point perhaps, I see my time really is getting, it's almost finished. I just want to mention a position which has changed over the years in Russia towards the European Union. It's very interesting to see how in the initial process of the accession process, the pre-accession and later the accession, including even the Baltic states, you must understand the sensitivity of such a thing for Russia, that Russia, under Yeltsin, said this is an internal affair of the European Union. It was something, it was almost like a neutral operation for Russia under the Yeltsin administration. I think for the EU, this was like a gift of the gods. And even not only for the EU, but especially for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, because you could move forward with your enlargement policy. But the EU, I think, made a terrible mistake to continue to think, and I use that expression in some publications already, that Russia was located on planet Mars, while we were moving eastwards all the time. And I think that is a historical mistake. And put in this framework, I understand some of the reactions of the Russian leadership towards further integrating parts of Eastern Europe in closer cooperation with the European Union, and if it goes further, with further enlargement. Because I think we should have handled this, we should have tried to handle that in another way. Of course, when Putin will arrive after Yeltsin, the first thing you will see, almost a few weeks later, you have the first memorandum with the negative effects of enlargement. When I study this memorandum, I can agree with virtually everything of the Russian remarks. I'm not a Russian, I'm not KGB agent or anything. But these are, in my opinion, remarks which make sense. I just take one as an illustration, you can reflect about it. The Kaliningrad issue. Kaliningrad, the area which became part of, a region which became part of the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Well, after enlargement, it was virtually impossible for Russians from mainland Russia to go to Kaliningrad and from Kaliningrad to Russia. If nothing had been arranged, because they would have a Schengen rule and so on, so it would have been very complicated. So that was certainly negative. A few weeks later, when a solution was found for Kaliningrad, a political solution here in Brussels, the 11th of November 2002, the same year, the EU started with its new policy towards European neighbourhood policy and later Eastern Partnership policy. That meant basically the relations with the other former Eastern European republics which were formerly part of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine or Moldova and others. You know that on this level we have reached certain agreements. Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, there we have association agreements which are very integration oriented, but they are not pre-accession agreements. The word accession is not mentioned nowhere. On this point, it's not really pre-accession, but on the other hand, it is integration to the internal market, and with as a main objective, gradual approximation. With some others, we don't go so far, Armenia, for example, also Azerbaijan, but that is a picture, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to make conclusions of what I said. There is opportunity to ask questions. My time is over. I think I should stop here, Chair, and give the floor back to you.